3. Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming back. I'm very happy to see some new faces now. So let me take one more minute to say again just a few words about this workshop. So we are doing this workshop together with Brendan Lucier from Microsoft Research. And this is about intersection between incentives and algorithms for optimizing the effort of others. This covers a few recent lines of work like algorithmic contract design, scoring rules, strategic classification, delegation, with very nice connections to other problems like profit inequality, Pandora box. We had the first tutorial this morning, and we are going to have the second tutorial now. We have about 75 minutes for this part. Let's try to make it about 1 hour and then leave some time for questions. And the second part of the tutorial is going to be given by, let me try to pronounce this again, Chara Podimata. Thank you.
Thank you, Michal. Mostly for the super honest effort to say my name as closely as possible to how the Greeks say it. For all the others who cannot say it, just forget about the C in front of it. Can you see me here? I'm relatively short for this podium, so I'm going to be speaking here. Yeah, so I'm going to switch gears a bit from the version of the model that Paul and Iqbal greatly introduced earlier on, and I'm going to be focusing more on like learning settings at this part of my talk. And excuse me in advance for those that were in this workshop like a week ago, there are some repeated slides. Just bear with me. I'm going to draw way more connections with contract design in this talk. So I'm sure most of you in this audience know, and Iqbal also introduced this, machine learning algorithms for consequential decision-making are almost everywhere nowadays. For example, a machine learning algorithm may decide whether you qualify for a loan or not, whether you will get probation, whether after a video interview with a video interview software, you will be invited for an on-site interview and ultimately be given the job of your dreams, and whether students that are applying to college will be admitted to the colleges of their choice. Now, because of how consequential these decisions are, people oftentimes try to change the data that they feed into these algorithms in an effort to obtain better outcomes for themselves. So in the loan approval example, people may try to increase the number of credit cards that they have, or increase the number of bank accounts that they have, or somehow improve their credit history. And similar examples of strategizing can be observed both in the student admissions example, where people can try to improve their GPA with various means. They may retake the GRE multiple times or even pay for tutoring classes, and they also sometimes change schools in order to obtain a better in-class ranking. And again, like similar examples can be observed also in the video interview software case. Now, I want to plant this seed into your brains right now that the examples of strategizing that I have here include both what people have called honest effort exertion and gaming. So in the loan approval example, by increasing the number of credit cards that you have, sometimes you try to game the system. You try to game the algorithm into believing that you're more credit worthy. But if you actually go the extra mile and pay off all your prior debts, then you end up actually becoming more credit worthy while improving your credit history. So keep these two ideas in mind, and I'm going to make this distinction clearer and how the literature has progressed based on this distinction in the next couple of slides. So what is the problem here? The problem here is that if machine learning algorithms ignore the strategic behavior, be it strategizing or honest effort exertion, then they risk making policy decisions that are incompatible with the original policy's goal. Put it differently, we end up incentivizing different actions from what we actually wanted to incentivize. Note that in the previous section that we just heard about, the algorithms were designed with a priori in mind the types of actions that they want to incentivize. Here I'm taking the opposite viewpoint. I'm saying what can happen if you don't pay attention to what actions you incentivize, essentially. So to make it more concrete, let me just address what can go wrong more specifically. So the reason why policymakers and mechanism designers decided that they want to use machine learning in the first place for addressing these types of questions is because we wanted to learn from human data and leverage whatever we learn to create better human decisions. And the reason why machine learning was deemed the appropriate tool, model for doing that, lies at the very heart of the machine learning paradigm that says that, well, if you're given access only to the training data and you want to test whatever you do on a test data population, then identifying patterns in the training data is enough to guarantee that you have approximate patterns in the test data. Put it differently, if a mechanism designer or policymaker is given access only to these prior past data, they can train a classifier that decides, let's say, whether people are actually qualified to be admitted to a school of their choice, and they can deploy this classifier to the new data that come, to the new students that apply to the school, and by standard guarantees of machine learning, we know that this classifier will be good enough for the test data, given some assumptions. So the root of the problem here is that the majority of the machine learning research assumes basically a static property of the data set, namely that the data does not have agency and they do not respond to the rules that we are deploying. But note that when we talk about these realistic settings that we had in mind, and let's focus on the concrete example of like students trying to get admitted to a school, data points correspond to agents. Each data point is comprised by a lot of features. Features can include the SAT score, the GPA, the class ranking, and so on and so forth. And essentially, the labels are whether the school thinks that the agent is qualified to be admitted or not. So here's pictorially what can go wrong. If you have some students that are close to the boundary, they are almost admitted to the school, but they're not actually qualified to be part of the school, then they may take small actions, like very small manipulations or strategizing that is hard to essentially understand. And this means that we no longer have the correct distinction between qualified and non-qualified individuals. And to make this more concrete, this means that our training decisions affect the way that we received test data. And if you come from a machine learning background, a version of this has been called distribution shift in standard machine learning. The difference here is that the distribution shift is governed by the behavior of the agents, and I'm going to make it more concrete in the next slide or two. So the whole research agenda that is referred to has various names because it's fairly recent and everyone is battling for getting their own name to be the common name. I like to call it incentive-aware machine learning. Strategic classification is another very nice name. We basically try to do three things. One is to study what happens if we ignore the effects of strategic behavior to machine learning algorithms. Say that you're deploying your favorite, I don't know, SGD to make some decision. What happens if you ignore the strategizing from the side of the agents? This is more of the quote-unquote equilibrium perspective from standard microeconomics. And then we take a more mechanism design-y perspective, where we try to create new ways, essentially new algorithms, that are, one, robust to strategizing. This takes the perspective of being robust to the gaming that the agents try to achieve. And two, essentially, what Inbal and Paul talked about previously, ways to incentivize honest effort exertion. And if you're here in this audience, I don't think I need to convince you, but since 2016, which is the first paper, a wonderful paper by Hart, Megiddo, Papadimitriou, and Wooters, this research area has really flourished, and every year we see great growth in papers and perspectives. And so, yeah, I think this is a good slide if you want to be up to date with the recent literature. I'd like to point out at this point, I can make my slides public afterwards, actually. I can put it on my website so you can all find it. So I'd like to say that, again, like computer scientists and machine learning folks sometimes like to think that we're reinventing the wheel. We're not. In fact, this problem has been appeared in different fields under different names. It has been known as the Goodhart's law or even the Campbell's law. And essentially what this means is that when you try to use a measure to target something, then it ceases to become a good measure. Pictorially, there is this like nail example here that's very nice, but I would like to focus back on the school admissions problem that we have as our running example. If I am the school and I want to be able to classify students based on the number of books that they have in their home, an easy rule would be to say, hey, I'm going to admit the students that have more than 100 books in their houses. Why? Well, because from market research, I have understood that folks with more books end up being more well-rounded, and they will be more qualified candidates. But note that if this is known, if this becomes known, then students can easily go and buy 10 or so more books, not read them, put them in their library in their house, and then admit it to the school of their choice. I know that this is a toy example, but I'm trying to illustrate the broader picture of like Goodhart's law. So this means that we have defeated the purpose of having books as a good measure of qualifications. So you may ask, what is new in today's research? And Tinbal also talked a bit about that when she talked about the connections between the economic design, the economic perspective in contract design, and the algorithmic perspective in contract design. So for one, right now, we have too many predictors to scrutinize individually. We can no longer create one single theory for like a single predictor that just gets deployed and then everything goes as planned in theory. Secondly, and there has been like a lot of talk about that in machine learning, we have black box models, models that we cannot probe directly because they come to us through, I don't know, some weird neural networks, for example. And also, again, like this is very nice that we had the first tutorial because what I'm going to talk about is only in high dimensions, whereas in Bal talked mostly, and then Paul, about combinatorial actions. So either a single action being played by the agent or a set of actions being played by the agent. I'm going to be taking a more continuum approach. I'm going to be focusing on actions that are essentially vectors, and they are living in high dimensions. And then what I think I'm trying to do here is I think this whole consideration creates a new Pareto frontier where we have to balance between the recourse that we allow the agents to have and the accuracy that our machine learning algorithms have. And I want to talk very briefly about recourse. What is recourse? So recourse is when you deploy a machine learning algorithm or an algorithm for that purpose, it's the ability of people that are judged by this algorithm to change acting upon the decisions of the algorithm. So if we are in the school example, that is our running example, well, I would like, I don't know, if I wanted to be admitted at Harvard, and Harvard says, hey, you're not admitted this year, I would like to be able to change my qualifications to be admitted afterwards, okay? So people, individuals, we always want recourse. We want to be able to change ourselves based on the decisions made by the algorithms. So a simple solution would be to get the institution, get Harvard, to admit everyone. Of course, this defeats the purpose of Harvard using a complex machine learning algorithm for making the decisions at the first place. So this is very much in contrast with what Harvard's objective is. So Harvard's objective is to achieve a level of accuracy, to, as we said, admit the most qualified people and not lose a lot, for many reasons, like revenue, profit, whatnot. So there seems to be, to me, that there is this tension between the two viewpoints that arises right now, which we did not have in contract design, where everything is announced a priori. The tension is that, and we're going to look back to that at the very end of the presentation, but I want, again, to like plant the seed in your minds. Well, practitioners say we should have obscure machine learning algorithms, not reveal anything about our models, because this is a risk to our accuracy based on strategizing. But on the other hand, I think that if we connect incentive-aware machine learning or strategic classification with contract design, we can advocate for something much stronger. We can advocate for models that are public or interpretable to an extent, and incentivize the types of efforts that we want from people. So every time that everyone tells you about incentive-aware machine learning or strategic classification, I like to think that there are 3 stakeholders that are involved, and basically if you have these stakeholders in mind, you can always understand what the tensions are and who wants what. On the one hand, we have the institution, let's say Harvard in our example. These are mechanism algorithm designers whose goal is to design learning tasks for accurate prediction based on, some profit objective function or justice objective function if we're talking about the probation decisions and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we have the individuals. These have been the students in our running example. These are the data providers who supply the data to the institution, and they can change their data however they deem fit, parentheses for this audience, based on a utility function that I'm going to specify in a minute. And the goal is to get the best outcomes for themselves. Lastly, the third key stakeholder is society. This includes all people and institutions as a whole. Society's goals are very broad. We strive for fairness, robustness to bad actors, and an increase in the social welfare of the population. And our actions, again, are very broad. We want to regulate. We want to create public pressure, create norms and expectations for the institutions and the algorithms that they deploy. So in this tutorial, I want to be able to at least give you a small hint about what the state of research is in this area right now. I'm going to start with the most traditional perspective, which has been the robustness one, where, again, the algorithm designer tries to be robust to gaming. Then I'm going to touch upon briefly the fairness perspective, where essentially I'm going to show to you that if you are agnostic to the different subpopulations that you have, then you will end up creating unfair solutions, even if you account for incentives. I'm going to touch upon the recourse performativity or causality perspective, which is the most recent in this area and which tries to go as close as possible to contract design. And I'll conclude with some of the biggest questions in this area in my viewpoint. So strategic classification has been studied so far in 2 big models. One is the offline model. It was introduced in this wonderful paper in ITCS 2016. And the paper models the problem as a Stackelberg game. So this is a Stackelberg game that is played between, and I'm sorry about the problems here. We had some problems like putting the slides in the computer. So we have an institution on the one side. This institution is, again, the school, the Harvard. And then we have individuals who apply to the school and want to be admitted. So think of these two as the principal and agent that Inbal and Paul talked about in the previous section. At the beginning of the interaction, nature chooses the agent's features. These are going to be denoted as X, and these correspond to the SAT score, the class ranking, and so on and so forth. Now the learner commits to a classifier alpha, and the agent observes this classifier and X. The agent then reports to the learner a potentially altered feature vector, delta of X, and the learner observes the label H of X, where H is essentially a hypothesis from our hypothesis class. This is the ground truth classifier. Finally, the learner gets utility, which is equal to the probability that the label that they assigned to the student is equal to the ground truth classification for the student. Okay? So again, things that I would like to stress. Here is the commitment power from the side of the learner, alpha. The agent gets to observe this classifier alpha and the X, which is not known to the learner at this point. The learner only gets to observe what happens to delta X. Okay? In the student example that we had before, if X is the original features, then you'd never observe the original features. Instead, you observe the features, the application that the student ends up sending. Maybe this is after they took tutoring classes, after they changed schools. This is all you get. I'm sorry. So I want to talk a bit about delta x and how it is modeled in this area. And in the next 2 or 3 slides, I have the connections and differences with moral hazard and contract design. Yes, there's a question? The question is whether the samples in the beginning that nature draws are labeled examples. You should think of them as labeled examples, yes. So whenever you see delta of x, you also get to see h of x, okay? And one assumption that I'm gonna make here is that h of x remains the same even after strategizing. And this is the key in the gaming perspective. It says that basically by acting upon what the classifier says, you do not change your inherent qualification. By retaking the GRE multiple times, you do not become more qualified to be admitted to Harvard, you just learn to game the system, okay? So delta x is the best response based on a utility function that is essentially the value for passing the classifier minus the manipulation cost. And the manipulation cost can include many things, can include the effort, the time that you spend exerting, the effort to change your qualifications, can include the money that you spend tutoring, and so on and so forth. And the assumption in this wonderful paper has been that the cost function is separable. And why have I listed the assumption here? Well, a way to understand the way that this literature progresses is that we are trying to start from something that looks like what the reality should be like, and then people kind of like question the assumptions on the cost functions and the models, and then like new research and progress is done in this area. So that's why I'm stressing the assumptions, because no guarantee that I will present in this talk is universal. All of them depend on very specific modeling assumptions, both from the side of the agent and from the side of the principal. So the goal here, when we talk about the offline perspective, is to compute a Stackelberg equilibrium. Basically, this is the following. This is a classifier alpha star that if the learner committed to the classifier and allowed the agents to best respond, this would have been the best classifier that the principal could have designed. Let me say this again, because if you're not familiar with Stackelberg, this can be very confusing. So someone draws the original x's. These are labeled examples, okay? Someone draws these x's, and this will remain the same. I don't get to observe the x's. What I'm doing is I'm saying that imagine that I could identify a single classifier that if I were to deploy it and allowed people to best respond given their x's, that would have been the best possible thing that I could have done. Is this clear? So the main result in this wonderful paper had been that basically for this offline model, we can learn the optimal alpha star in polynomial time and sample complexity. And one thing that I'd like to point out here, and which greatly contrasts with contract design, is that although in contract design there seems to be this commitment power has a very strict timeline, very recently in the machine learning literature, people have started questioning whether this timeline is as I'm presenting it here, as it is the case that, for example, every time the learner commits to something and you have agents best responding. It seems to be the case that there are misaligned timelines, and this wonderful paper by Zernich, Mazumdar, Sastry, and Jordan in NeurIPS 2021 basically changes the order of play between the principal and the agent, okay? Now, if you ignore everything else that I say in this tutorial, I think this is my most important slide. This is my effort to understand how the strategic classification offline model looks like a moral hazard type of problem. But again, this is my effort, and it may contain errors, so this is up for discussion. So I think that we can interpret the agent's original features as something like an inherent effort level. Inbal talked to us about the way that original actions correspond to outcomes through a randomization process, which involves this error epsilon that's drawn from a distribution. Well, if you think of this epsilon as not drawn from a distribution, but drawn from nature, I don't know, and this is the effort level the extra effort level that you're going to exert, I think this looks fairly similar. Then the learner's classifier is what we call in contract design the contract, okay? So if the contract W sees outcome Q from the agent's effort, so as we talked about in the previous section about linear contracts, there is this relationship between a base salary and a bonus rate. Now, again, we have agents best responding. In the strategic classification model, the agents best respond according to this kind of like linear type utility function, which is like value minus cost. Whereas in the moral hazard literature, we usually study smoother functions. Then here's a big difference. The learner on one side observes delta x, which is an altered action, whereas in moral hazard, the principal only observes the outcome, which is essentially the action of the agent plus this epsilon that is hidden from them. And then, again, we have differences in how we measure learner's utility. In the strategic classification setting, the learner's utility is essentially like the number of mistakes that you made, like smoothened out by the probability of each feature being chosen. Whereas in the moral hazard literature, we have this like linear property of like the principal's utility being associated by the outcome that they observe minus the contract that they paid out to the agents. And something very interesting that Paul, I believe, briefly touched upon, or no, it was one of the last slides from Inbal's section. This linearity that people advocated for in microeconomics as being the optimal thing to do in contract design actually has very recently been proven to be the case for some very particular cases when we talk about machine learning settings. This is the paper by Kleinberg and Raghavan in EC 2019. So there are some connections there, although there are differences, there definitely seem to be some connections. We just don't know how to translate from strategic classification to contract design and vice versa. And even if it is possible, I don't know. I want to touch upon some differences very briefly. Okay, the action versus outcome observed, that's the obvious one that we talked about when I introduced the model. There is another one that I talked when I was introducing what I'm going to be talking about, this single action versus continuum of actions feature, which is essentially, I'm going to be talking about strategizing and changing your feature vectors rather than choosing from a discrete action set. Here, I very recently heard a talk by Michal on combinatorial contracts, and I'm actually hopeful that there may be things to do so that we can translate and make connections between like combinatorial contracts and continuous actions. And another thing that's very important is that in strategic classification, the outcomes that we have are not always observed. Note that in the strategic classification for Harvard, for example, you only get to observe what happened to the students that you admitted. You don't get to see what happens to the other students. So it looks like we have something like censored data here, and the censoring depends on the way that we have filtered the people in the beginning. So there's a lot of correlation. It's not that the censoring is independent of our actions. It's that we make some decisions, and then we end up censoring the feedback that we get. So from the critiques of the offline model, which had been like the separability, the assumption that everything was known for the learner, there has emerged this online model for strategic classification, where essentially the interaction between the institution and the agent is repeated and happens over a sequence of rounds. And not only that, but essentially we assume that we do not know exactly the utility functions that the agents use. More specifically, this is an interaction that happens over T rounds. At the beginning, again, we have nature choosing the agent's features, like again, the SAT score, the class ranking, and so on and so forth. This is denoted as XT now, because again, the features change per round. The learner decides to pick a classification rule, which is going to be linear in the D dimensional features. The agent now gets to observe the classifier and the data point that nature chose. The agent reports to the learner a potentially altered feature vector, x hat t of alpha t. And the learner observes the label yt, which remains the same because we still talk about gaming, and incurs a type of loss, which I'm going to specify at the next slide. And here I'm going to pause for a second, because this is a very dense slide, and usually it's the point where people get very confused about this model, and take any questions that you may have. Let me fill the silence by saying the following. If you come from standard machine learning, what is different here? The difference is that when someone samples data, you have access to this type of data that is sampled, and then you deploy your algorithms on this data. What changes here is that data is sampled somehow from a data generating process. They go into an algorithmic box, which is essentially the utility of the agents, and they get spit out as best responses. And this is where you judge your algorithms on. Okay? Yes? Yes, Michal.
I'll be happy if you repeat the model.
Yes, good.
Thank you.
Good, thank you. So I'll repeat the model with the example in mind. So nature somehow from, I don't know, from the way that we are born, we are in our communities, we have some features as students. These can be, I don't know, the original SAT score that we have right now, the original GRE that we would have if we just go right now and take a GRE test. Yeah, things that you haven't manipulated. Then Harvard decides on a classification rule, which is essentially who gets admitted at Harvard or not, based on some features. Okay? When Harvard decides on that rule, they do not know of the current strategizing. They just base their thinking on past data. Okay? Then the agent, so a student, observes exactly Harvard's rule, and they best respond. And this best response is governed by a utility function that says that, hey, if you have 10 hours budget to spend to changing your qualifications, to have essentially this x hat t of alpha t, this is the way that you spend your budget. Then Harvard observes this application that lands in their hands, which is the altered feature vector x hat t, and yt, which is the ground truth label. And ultimately, the learner incurs classification loss. So this is like Harvard, like after 10 years, they're like, hey, let's try to identify what was the loss for admitting the type of people that we admitted. And there are two things that sound awfully bad in this model when I talk about it in this like societal setting of Harvard and admitting students. If anyone wants to tell me right now, yes?
Is it that part of the change from X to X hat is genuine and part of it, sorry, I didn't make that noise. I mean, I guess part of it is genuine and part of it is gaming, and it's kind of hard to say.
Excellent question. That's the first thing that I wanted to get attacked on. Yes, that's true. And that's what motivates essentially the recourse perspective in this type of literature. I wanted to set up the problem. So historically, this model was originally suggested for spam classification. So it only focused on gaming attempts. I wanted to set up the problem with the example of like students and school, because this is easier to see there that, hey, like sometimes you honestly exert effort and you become more qualified. And we're going to see that in the recourse and causality perspective in, I don't know, 10 minutes or so from now. And yes?
Is it possible to imagine that the agents observe like a noisy version of the classifier?
Excellent question. In case folks didn't hear the question, it's whether it's possible to assume that the agents observe a noisy version of the classifier. That's the second thing that I want to be attacked on, namely the big assumption that the classifier is always observed by this agent to the dot. This has been the state of the art, essentially, in this type of literature. Because again, we wanted to take a type of worst case perspective, be like, what happens if they're able to observe exactly what you do? And I think that this is something that, because this literature is coming mostly from like AGT-related folks, this is something that we inherit from like contract design type of things, that we announce exactly the way that we're gonna score you. To your question, in reality, machine learning rules right now are never fully transparent. And very recently, there have been only 2 papers that study what happens if the decision rules are I'm lying, 3 papers, if they are non-transparent. I'm gonna briefly touch upon this at the very end of the discussion. Yes, Bo? Oh, Michal, yes?
Can you say a few words about the relation of this model to the Kleinberg-Raghavan paper?
Yeah, excellent. So the Kleinberg and Raghavan paper, which essentially, it was a version of contract design in learning classifiers, is very different in the sense that I believe that it's focused on like a single dimensional example, and it mostly focuses on a single agent setting. So here we have like potentially multi-agent setting, but from a homogeneous population. And also they were trying to, again, like incentivize a particular type of effort profile for the students. So if we were able to generalize the ideas in Kleinberg and Raghavan for high dimensional regression or classification, that would be a direct generalization of this model. And I believe there's a question to Bo, or that Bo has.
Or if you don't mind a comment, I thought it'd be nice to expand a little on why it's so fragile to assume that agents exactly see the classifier and exactly respond to it.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because we're doing this sort of econometrics where we take a bunch of data that was generated strategically, we infer the agent's types, and then we sort of create a mechanism that would be good for those types. And so if the agents aren't actually generating this data in the exact model that we assume, at least in the first paper, everything would break. So yeah, just to your point.
Yeah, so I 100% agree. Thank you for the comment. Bo was actually, in the first, this original EC18 paper that proposed this model. So at the very end, actually, in case that, because I much prefer having a discussion rather than, going over slides, I want to make sure that this point is voiced before we break for lunch. I think it's one of the biggest open directions, in my viewpoint, to bring together the perspective of, machine learning rules are never fully observed and they are never fully understood by people. At the very best, we have sample access or probe access. So what can we do in this case? I mean, people take all sorts of actions, but can we actually incentivize them properly? Or can we prevent gaming? But this is, I think, to my viewpoint, one of the biggest research directions in this area. Okay. So again, as I said earlier, basically all of these models, this online learning formulation, they focused on different versions of what the learner and the agent cares about. So in online learning, in this online formulation, we want from the institution to minimize Stackelberg regret. What is Stackelberg regret? Stackelberg regret is the difference between the loss that you pick up from deploying a sequence of classifiers alpha T, allowing the agents to best respond. So this is basically if you deployed this algorithm here and you chose alpha T according to an algorithmic process, this is the loss that you would have picked up. And now this weird thing here is the best fixed linear classifier had you given the opportunity to all of the agents to best respond. In case this reminds you of something, this ideally would be the Stackelberg equilibrium here. So in an offline model, where everything was static and there was not an online generation of data, this here would have been the Stackelberg equilibrium. So essentially, we want to be able to do, on aggregate, as close as possible as the Stackelberg equilibrium. And in the original paper, I'm going to introduce first what happens in the next papers. We focused on binary classification losses, so we cared about minimizing the number of times that we make a mistake when we classify an individual. In the original paper, folks focused on a much smoother version of the loss function. I'm going to explain in 2 slides from now why this was so important. But the other piece where all of these models are different is how is the response of the agents decided, okay? So I told you that every time you have to specify, one, how the learner measures their success, and then how the agent measures how they best respond. So here in the original paper, agents were myopically rational, and they essentially reported the x hat t of alpha t, which is the best response, the maximization for the value for passing the classifier. This is just the inner product between the classifier and x, the changed point, minus the cost for moving from their original data point of x to an x prime. In the paper of STOC’22 that we wrote with Yiling and Young, we said that, hey, we think that a more general type of model, which kind of like tries to bridge between adversarial machine learning and this type of model that we have here in strategic classification, is that agents can move in a ball of radius delta around their true data point. How do you interpret that? Well, if your original application, again, was like this xt here, and you had a budget of, I don't know, $100 to spend in order to make your change, then you would land somewhere within this ball, but I will not constrain you exactly on which function you used, so I cannot predict exactly by seeing xt where exactly you will. And this was strengthened in the subsequent paper of Ahmadi, Behagi, Blum, and Nagira in EC21, where they said that, hey, for some reasonable cost functions, namely cost functions that are related to the L1 or L2 model, which are, we can believe that they are very natural in reality, well, we can predict that by xt, you just try to just surpass the classifier, and this is where you stop. And this was crucial in the result because they wanted to change standard perceptron algorithm into a strategic version that used these types of incentives in order to obtain the very fast guarantees that they obtained. So to summarize this whole literature, the main question here is, from the side of the institution, given different assumptions on the utility functions of the agents and the losses that you care about, how do you learn to classify with diminishing regret? Essentially, as we said before, in the presence of an online model, do something that does on aggregate as well as the Stackelberg equilibrium would do offline. And the main results in this area in general, and here's again where the distinction based on the utility functions and the losses will be crucial, are, so in the original paper, Dong, Roth, Suchman, Wagner, and Wu in EC18 essentially said that, hey, if the loss function is smooth enough and the utility of the agent is also smooth enough, then at the very least, we can mask the problem as a standard bandit convex optimization. So applying off the shelf your favorite bandit convex optimization algorithm would guarantee good regret, square root d, t, 3/4. Okay? D again is the number of features, T is the number of time steps where this interaction happens. Taking it a step further, in the model that we had for NeurIPS, where agents were best responding in a ball of radius delta, but you didn't know exactly where they landed, we showed that, well, you can learn adaptively to the sophistication of the agents. You can have nearly tight regret that is square root t and logarithmically dependent on terms that depend on the sophistication of the agents. So basically, if your agents are not so sophisticated, you can learn very fast. But if they are sophisticated and nature has decided the original data points in a fully adversarial manner, well, there's nothing that you can do because this is like an upper and a lower bound. And then in this like very, very nice paper by Ahmadi, Behagi, Blum, and Nagira, as I previously kind of like said briefly, the author showed that, well, what happens in the good scenarios where you have some data that originally were linearly separable, say the original applications for the students had like a clear boundary between the qualified and not qualified students, and can you essentially change somehow the perceptron algorithm into a strategic version that still converges in constant number of mistakes? Very nice paper. So this was an overview of the robustness perspective, and of course there are very interesting techniques, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of the types of results that we have in this perspective. I'll take one or two questions in this perspective, and then I'll move on to how this perspective misses the fairness perspective.
Might be a very naive question, but if you restrict your online model to a single round, is it kind of equivalent to the offline one?
Is the question if you restrict your model to
The online model, yes.
to a single algorithm?
Yes. To a single round.
To a single round? Yes, it's equivalent, yes.
Okay, thank you.
So another very probably naive question. So there seems to be a relationship between this robustness, adversarial robustness, and kind of the stability of the algorithm. For example, in your model where you're moving. So can you tell me why it kind of doesn't reduce to the same type of stability or kind of generalization properties where you just don't want your learner to change too much if your data doesn't change too much?
So the general answer here is that we don't know whether stability, actually this is also one of the other big questions that I had open. There should be cases where, and by cases I conjecture that it's for sure, I conjecture that it holds for smooth loss functions and smooth utility functions, that if you have stability, then this guarantees that you can learn well with respect to the Stackelberg benchmark. And in fact, there is a paper from ICML20, which I'm going to briefly touch upon in the performativity part, where essentially they do the following. They say, hey, there are cases where we can just end up having a stable classifier, and that's good enough. But these cases have strict assumptions in the loss functions that you have and in the utility functions for the agents. In the particular paper that I touched upon, we show that the NeurIPS paper with the ball, the movement in the ball, we show that any algorithm that has diminishing external regret, which means that they compare against kind of like the worst case adversarial perspective for the agents, has to have linear Stackelberg regret and vice versa, which is a very bleak result, which says, because it says that you have to pick your battles. If your battle is against the strategizing of the agents, then you may end up being very bad with respect to quote-unquote adversarial robustness. But again, I'm not claiming that this is true for all of the settings. This is true only for the settings where you care about the 0-1 loss for the learner, and the agents have these discontinuities in the way that they try to jump the boundary. I'm happy to discuss more offline. Okay? Okay. So the implicit assumption so far has been that our agents are coming from a homogeneous population. What do I mean by that? Well, the way that I introduced the model is that there's a learner. This learner is, I don't know, a school, a college, and they want to decide who will be successful at the college. So there comes a student. This student somehow changes their data according to the complex utility functions that we talked about previously, and then they can change the policy decisions for themselves based on this change that happened here. Now, and this touches upon a question that Michal had earlier. Although I talked about a single agent, this generalizes to a homogeneous population of agents. Okay? But again, in reality, our populations are highly, highly heterogeneous. So in the school admissions example, you shouldn't expect that all of the students have the same access to tutoring schools. you shouldn't accept that all of the students have the same ability to change school so that they obtain a better in-class ranking. So here's a big question here. What goes wrong if we try to adapt to strategizing? So we try to compute algorithms that reach the Stackelberg equilibrium, or the Stackelberg best fixed optimum for the regret, in the presence of highly heterogeneous populations. So this has been studied in 2 concurrent works, excellent, very bright-eyed works by Hu, Imorlika, and Vaughan in FATSTAR 16, and Milley, Miller, Dragan, and Hart. Basically, I'm going to try to explain to you the idea behind these papers pictorially with as few math as possible. So here's what happens here. Assume that we have only 2 subpopulations. Let's say that here is the subpopulation 1 and here is subpopulation 2. This subpopulation, let's say, that belongs to an advantaged group, and this subpopulation here belongs to a disadvantaged group, okay? And the assumption that I'm going to make is that both groups include qualified and non-qualified individuals. If there was a ground truth oracle that gave me the labels of the agents, of the students, both populations have students that would be excellent candidates for our school and not very good candidates for our school. So given this, and given what we discussed previously about the robustness perspective, our algorithm, our school, may deploy a linear classifier, alpha t, which judges all of the students in these subpopulations as non-qualified to be admitted. So based on the strategic viewpoint that we introduced in the previous slides, what's going to happen now is that students, according to their manipulation or strategizing power, they may try to jump the boundary and be admitted to the school. And here's where the heterogeneity comes into play. If we talk about a population of advantaged students, these students have a greater manipulation power. So although both of these groups contained qualified and non-qualified individuals originally, okay, by taking into account strategizing, only one of the populations is clearly better off. So what did we end up doing? We started by wanting to have algorithms that protect the institution so that they make better decisions, whatever quote-unquote better means. And we ended up like excluding qualified folks from subpopulation 2. Why? Because if the learner computes the Stackelberg equilibrium classifier, this classifier, say, can be somewhere here. And of course, this is like a toy example, okay? Then they end up, like, you see, much greater percentage of these folks can jump the classification threshold, whereas these folks now have no opportunity to respond and to be deemed as qualified. And in summary, what we see is that strategic classification, if we don't take into account the heterogeneity of populations, disproportionately affects disadvantaged subpopulations. And there are various measures to quantify that. I didn't introduce them here. The key distinction between the 2 papers is according to how they measure what this disproportionately affects means, whether we talk about like a social burden or false positives, false negatives, and so forth. Surprisingly, and in a very, very sad twist of events, there are cases where subsidies, trying to subsidize populations, can make both populations worse off, while making the learner better off. Okay? I will not go into details about that. This is, again, another very bleak point, and it's showcased in the paper of Hu et al. With like very intricate counterexamples. Now, I want to point out that the insights here hold for the cases where the classification rule is revealed to the agents. So, again, what do I mean by that? I mean that the algorithm, what we were discussing previously, is that the algorithm is public knowledge. I don't know if she's in the audience. Sumega Garg and Mark Braverman have an excellent paper in STOC '22, where they argue for randomized classifiers as a way to help with the equilibrium outcomes. And here's where another huge question of the field arises. How do you convince policymakers to deploy randomized classifiers? If we really want to drive change with this area, how do you go about saying that, hey, you can have the same feature vector as your neighbor, but because of some random coins, you may end up in school and they may end up not in school? It's very hard to convince people that this is the correct thing to do here. Yes?
Can you say a few more words about making both subpopulations worse off? Because to me it seems like a zero-sum game.
Yeah, so it's not, because can we take this question offline? This is actually quite technical.
Yes.
Okay? Yes, Bo?
I was wondering if you could comment about these results relating to the two types of manipulation, like gaming versus sort of inherent improvement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's an excellent question. Those results only have appeared in the case of gaming. I have a recent paper in ICML this year with Yahav Bekavod, Stephen Wu, and Jubaziani, where we show that similar types of unfairness or disproportionate basically outcome improvement can be observed in cases where you have different subpopulations who try to exert effort to improve themselves. And it's even sadder than that, because this is also the case in our primitive. We assume that the agents cannot observe fully the classification algorithm. So what drives our results is the inability of the agents to have a full grasp of the decision-making rule, even though they are trying to improve their outcomes for themselves. But if you care about decision rules that are public knowledge and agents are trying to exert effort to improve themselves, I don't think that there has been done any work on showing whether there is disproportionate effect. Okay, so again, this should come as no surprise to you now, because we've had these discussions. It's not all just gaming. If one of the best ways to improve your credit score is to pay back all of your debts, and the ability to pay back all of your debts crucially affects your ability to pay back future loans. So this is a classical example of not just gaming. There are way more viewpoints to just assuming that people are gaming the system. To drive this message home, there have been this excellent paper by Kleinberg and Ravavan that we have briefly touched upon in our discussions here. Papers by Miller, Milley, Hart, about the fact that essentially strategic classification is causal modeling in disguise. Another excellent paper from Hadalab, Imorlika, Lucier, and Wang at STOC’22, and a recent paper by Shavit, Endelman, and Axelrod. So basically what these papers are advocating is the following, that, hey, the viewpoint that we've been taking now is that we have a model, and this model takes features into account and issues a prediction about the person. So in the school problem, our model is based on past populations. What is the correlation between application features and whether the students are admitted to school or not? And then I'm going to see the features of the students and issue a prediction. What happens in reality is that there's another arrow here, which is that what we have argued through the motivation for strategizing is that, well, when the models are used for so consequential decisions, they actually end up informing the features that we feed into the prediction. But note that this arrow now creates another arrow, which is that sometimes if you exert effort, then you may end up affecting your true classification label. So I know very few things about the American school system, but I've been told that students that go through the advanced placement program essentially are improving greatly their features, they are improving greatly their qualifications, and so they end up being uniquely positioned to be super qualified to be part of the top schools in the country. So we touched upon that with a question that Shadin asked earlier, whether it's causation or just correlation. So if, for example, you use a measure like books, then this does not actually change your college GPA, but it may end up changing the classification that a toy example algorithm uses. So this is like another pictorial representation of when looking at the data, trying to recover which relationships essentially lead to gaming and which relationships lead to actual effort incentivizing. And I want to touch upon basically this point here. So if we were able to create algorithms that essentially are the perfect analog of contract design or moral hazard algorithms, these algorithms could be public, they could be fully transparent, and they would incentivize our agents to exert effort in the correct directions. So in principle, these algorithms would incur no cost to transparency, okay? But we don't have that right now. And so I want to spend a few minutes talking about whether the transparency assumption is realistic. I'm right now at the 1 hour mark, so I'll go fast from now on, but I'm happy that we've had some questions already. So in standard, I want to revisit a bit this like primitive of incentive-aware learning, strategic classification, which says that, well, the agents obtain the rule exactly from the learner, and they go into this like intricate process of changing their features to obtain a better policy decision for themselves. Again, I don't need to convince you that institutions, when I talk about institutions, I not only mean schools, but banks, credit institutions, credit companies, they rarely reveal their decision rules. And there are many reasons like privacy, proprietary software, and so on and so forth, okay? So let's look at our school example that keeps motivating our discussion here, and assume that we have two populations of students, okay? Our orange population will be the students that are advantaged, okay? And the green subpopulation are the students that are disadvantaged. Now, note that another thing that happens in reality, in which previous models failed to capture, is that because of the way that neighborhoods are structured and because of the way that information is clustered in our communities, we end up trying to receive information about the algorithms that we care about from our social networks. In the example that the running example of schools and students, students from the advantaged group can go to a tutoring school that has a lot of previously labeled examples and a lot of people that were actually positively admitted to the school. But on the other hand, you have the disadvantaged population that does not have access to these like intricate rules, and instead they just ask their friends around, and of course they don't even have that many positively labeled examples. So if we believe that agents, students, somehow adapt their knowledge based on what the sample access of the data they received, the people, the agents, build kind of like their own idea of what the mechanism looks like. So the advantaged population thinks that the classification rule is this way, and the disadvantaged one believes that the rule is something very different. But based on this understanding that they have, which is different from each other, they feed these into like the agents, and then they go through the strategizing process that we mentioned above. So again, what is different here? It's not only different that people have different ability to misreport or to strategize. It's also different that they start from a very, very different perspective of the world. Is that clear? Translating to the contract design thing, this would be that people do not understand the contract that we offer. Instead, they understand it partially. In this paper, we presented a version of what understand partially means. I'm happy to take questions about what it is technically and what are the next steps, but let's roll with this for now. So here's a provocative question, 5 minutes, yes. If we try to optimize for social welfare of the total population, so both the advantaged and the disadvantaged group, how does this information discrepancy affect the subpopulation's ability to improve? And I'll tell you, which I have already prefaced it, is that there is like great disparate effect. The disadvantaged subpopulation may end up way strictly worse, which is, again, very bleak, because it means that even if both subpopulations strive for improvement, we end up making only one population better off when we thought that we are incentivizing both populations to be better off, which is a striking contrast with what happens in contract design. When you announce the contract and you think that you incentivize something, this ends up being incentivized. Here we see the opposite. So there are some positive things, which are that sometimes when the information is not very conflicting and there's not a lot of friction in the information that the groups are getting, and again, find me afterwards for discussing what that means, we will be able to achieve the optimal outcome, subpopulation optimal outcome improvement. But one thing that I want to say here is that this basically, to me, looks like an argument in favor of almost like an affirmative action in terms of information. So if we understand that disadvantaged populations for these algorithms have they end up resulting in these very disparate outcomes, we should essentially give more information to the disadvantaged groups so that we can try to bring the balance. Now, in the interest of time, I will not discuss in more detail these results. And we briefly touched upon performativity, very, very briefly. So I want you to remember this picture, which that there seems to be a tension here. One is that standard machine learning is advocating for obscure machine learning algorithms because they have the advantage that they stop strategic behavior. But on the other hand, they're non-transparent. And as people, as individuals, not as only as scientists, but as people being in this world, we want to be able to understand why some decisions are made for our lives the way that they are made. So I want to advocate for transparent machine learning algorithms, which have been shown to, under some specific cases, be able to incentivize efforts for outcome improvement, but they're super prone to strategic behavior. I think, and again, that's my belief here, I think that we should be able to find a version of interpretability for which both is achieved. So a version of interpretability that both satisfies the institution's goals of producing accurate outcomes and the people's goals of being able to probe these outcomes to understand why these decisions were made for themselves the way that they were made. And to me, for this great audience, if you want to jump into this research agenda, I think the majority of the technical questions that we need to answer is in this bullet point here in red. So one of the first things that we need to understand is what happens for nonlinear rules. So contract design focuses on this linearity of contracts because of this theorem that says that they're basically optimal. But we don't have this direct correspondence here. And it's also very hard to convince companies that, hey, throw away your favorite SGD model and just use this linear algorithm that I give you. So we need to understand theoretically what happens for nonlinear algorithms. And we also need to understand what happens when agents do not fully understand the rules and they cannot fully best respond, okay? So if you're a student, sometimes it's hard to super well optimize the budget that you have at hand and take exactly the correct decisions that will make you the optimal effort exertion, okay? Then the next thing, which is, I believe, for those of you who are interested in bridging this technical, super technical area with policymaking, is to build large case studies so that we can really start the dialogue between policymakers and ourselves, the technical folks. And in case you're interested, we had a STOC’21 tutorial which translated all of these super technical notions into basically plain English so that we could communicate with lawmakers and not economists and policymakers. And I think this is for me the holy grail, being able to create a version of interpretability that simultaneously achieves robustness and incentivizes honest effort improvement. There is a second big theme that I will not touch upon. This basically has to do with the way that we believe that people behave. In the interest of time, I want to just highlight this recent paper by Jagadisan, Mendler, Donner, and Hart, where basically they try to create alternative microfoundations for the agent's behavioral model, because everything that I mentioned here focuses on agents that are best responding exactly. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't believe that agents can do that. So a first attempt towards that was this wonderful STOC’21 paper. And myself with other great folks, we've made some other efforts towards going beyond myopia and best response that I will not touch upon, but find me afterwards in case you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chara. We have just a few minutes for some questions. We had a few during the talk. Yes.
I guess related to the last open direction. So if the agents are not best responding, but they're like epsilon best responding somehow, does that itself kind of already play nicely into the resulting guarantees?
Yeah, so excellent question. In some cases, yes. In some others, no. So I believe that, although I haven't tested it, but in the smoothness, in your doesn't? I doubt it. You doubt it? I would think that you scale with, okay, we can take it offline, but I think that my hunch would be that if you have smoothness on both sides, smoothness on the side of the individual and on the learner, maybe you can do something, but it's unclear.
Any other question?
So today, do you know how strong is the link between all of these theoretical insights and the empirical research?
Yeah, excellent question. I don't know if people heard that. So the question is, how strong is the link between the theoretical insights that I mentioned here and the empirical side of things? The answer is sadly not that strong. And there are many reasons for that. One is that, well, this is a very young research agenda. I personally have started talking to some folks, so we'll see how that goes. But it's important to remember that we are talking about algorithms that are deployed by big corporations and the government or whatnot, and it's very hard to convince them that, hey, throw away the models that your favorite machine learning algorithm created and go with the models that we suggest. So that's why I always like to highlight the fact that even if we prove the best theorems possible, we always need to be able to go back and chat with policymakers or the industry, so that if we really want this to actually drive change.
Okay, great. So let's thank all three speakers of this session again, Inbal Talgam Cohen, Paul Duding, and Chara Podimata. Thank you.